Hi, I'm Lara.
And I'm David.
Welcome to the Fix It in Photoshop series of video shorts.
Today's video is sponsored by the folks at Dehancer, who have asked us to do an unbiased review of their film emulation software. In the digital age of photography and filmmaking, we have become accustomed to near perfection in our images. Before the birth of the digital age, we had to capture pictures using negatives and then process them in a lab. Believe it or not, the digital camera was invented in 1975, although the technology didn't hit the mainstream consumer until the 1990s. During the analog age, numerous variables directly affected the look and feel of your final printed images. This included the make and type of negative film used, the in-camera settings when you captured the image, how the image was developed in a lab, the type of paper used to develop your images. Here's a photo of mine from the early 1990s taken on a Canon SLR using Kodak Gold 200 film and processed onto Fuji paper. You can immediately tell this looks more organic than modern-day photographs. Programs like Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom allow us to emulate certain elements of the analog age. For example, adding grain, toning, and color grading. However, if you're looking for the specific look and feel of the analog age, with precise control over the developing process, then Dehancer's film emulation software may be worth your time to take a look at. The software has over 60 photographic and movie films stored as presets. For each preset, you have full control over the tonal balance, and effects such as film grain, halation, bloom, and many more. You also have the flexibility to create your own presets. Rather than try to cover all of the films available, let's look at one and see what happens when we take a wildlife image, which I took in 2024 using a Canon EOS 5D Mark IV and a Canon 200-400 f4 prime lens, and then use the Kodak Gold 200 preset to see if we can get something that looks similar to the image I took whilst on safari in the 1990s. So without further ado, over to you, Lara.
Thanks, David. The Dehancer Film plugin works with both Photoshop and Lightroom. For this example, we will look at a typical workflow using Photoshop. The principle is the same though for either Lightroom or Photoshop. The first thing we want to do is open our image in Adobe Photoshop. I recommend that you work using RAW files. This gives more headroom for processing. You can work with compressed files like JPEG, but just bear in mind that these have already been pre-processed by your camera and there are fewer pixels to play with. So, more chance of overprocessing your images and getting unwanted artifacts. Now, the Dehancer team recommends generic settings for tonal balance. I've done some testing on this, and I get better results properly tonally balancing your image. I'm going to do this very quickly, but you can check our channel for a detailed tutorial on tonal balancing in Photoshop. Working from the light panel, I'm starting by calibrating the blacks. Press and hold Option on a Mac or Alt on Windows, and then adjust the black slider until the mask displays roughly 10% pixels. Now press and hold Option on a Mac or Alt on Windows. Then adjust the white slider until the mask displays some pixels, and then bring that back slightly so that there are no longer any pixels displayed on the mask. For shadows, I do this completely by eye. In this case, I want to create a good balance so that the textures in the forest background stand out. I will enhance this effect further when we set contrast. For highlights, I want the light sections on this nuthatch to pop out by increasing the highlight slider. This also adds more interest to the lighter sections in the background. Finally, I'm boosting the contrast. Next, I want to add some edge sharpness. The Dehancer team recommends not adding any sharpening at all. I think this is likely because of the risk of unwanted blooming around highlights when we jump into Dehancer. However, I prefer to add sharpness in Camera Raw and counteract the risk of blooming by taking an extra precautionary step of defringing the image. I've gone ahead and quickly sharpened the image, but if you want to see how this is done, we have a detailed video on our channel. Now working from the optics panel, I'm checking the defringe option. As discussed, this will hopefully counteract any unwanted effects when we jump into the Dehancer Film plugin. Let's exit Camera Raw now and get into Photoshop. Before initializing the Dehancer Film plugin from Photoshop, I recommend converting your image into a smart object. This way, Any changes we make are non-destructive, and we have the added benefit of being able to jump in and out of Dehancer in the future if we need to apply any adjustments to the film plugin effect. To do this, just right-click on the layer and then select Convert to Smart Object from the menu options. Now with the layer still selected, head up to the menu bar and select Filter Dehancer Film. The Dehancer Film plugin then opens. The plugin is set out with film profiles and presets on the left-hand side of the interface. Tonal, color, and print settings sit on the right-hand side. In the center of the interface sits your image as you would expect, but you also get a very prominent histogram curve, which is a nice touch because the histogram is a great way to visualize the overall balance of your image. I'm going to start with the source correction tool to make refinements to the tonal and white balance. I'm pretty happy with the tonal balance as we spent time on this in Camera Raw. In fact, if we check the clipping mask, we can see we have about 10% black pixels represented by the blue highlight, and the white pixels are just peeking through, represented by the red highlight. So we are exactly where we intended to be. However, I didn't adjust the white balance whilst we were in Camera Raw, and I think the image needs to be a little warmer, so I'm going to boost the temperature compensation slightly. Now let's set up a film profile. On the left-hand side of the interface, we can select from presets, which pretty much set everything up for us, or we can start with a film profile and then build things up ourselves. I'm going to use a film profile. We'll go with the Kodak Gold 200. We can see from the histogram that this has darkened the overall image and removed some of the warmth, so we need to make some adjustments. I'm starting with the push-pull slider to open up the shadows and color balance. Now I'm heading across to the expand section to reset the black and white points to bring the tonal balance back within our desired range. Next, we set up the print profile, and for this example, we are using the Fujifilm setting. When we do this, we can see from the histogram that our red channel has gone outside our dynamic range, so I'm reducing the tonal contrast and the exposure to bring everything back into line. If we now check our before-after view, we can see that the print profile setting has also negatively impacted our black point. So I'm revisiting the expand section to correct this. I just need to push the blacks slightly to bring them back in. For this image, I think we are about there. But nothing says analog than a little bit of film noise. However, if we take a closer look at this image, we can see that there is already a little noise, as it was photographed in low light with an ISO of 8000. But for the sake of completeness, let's go ahead and add just a touch more. Here's a quick before and after view of our image. Once happy with the changes, we just click OK to return to Photoshop.
Thanks, Laura. That was a great demo. So what did you think of the Dehancer plugin?
Well, at first glance, I have to admit I found the interface slightly daunting. But it didn't take that much time to get up to speed with the software, as the help guides provided by Dehancer are pretty good. As an example, when you select a film profile, you need to set the exposure of the profile using the EV slider in order to get the desired color contrast. The reference to EV is a nod to the days of analog processing when the developer would push or pull the exposure. So you obviously need to invest time reading the Dehancer manuals to understand some of these terms. But once you do, you realize the user interface is quite intuitive.
When I first looked at the plugin, I was somewhat skeptical, as it's essentially based on using presets and then fine-tuning them.
That's essentially true, David. But unlike the majority of other presets available, these are based on actual vintage film stocks, so they have a historical basis. If you have an in-depth knowledge of how to use curves in Photoshop or Lightroom, then you can emulate some of the looks in Dehancer. What I will say, though, is that whilst Photoshop and Lightroom are an industry standard, in the wrong hands it's very easy to make a perfectly good image look perfectly bad. The advantage I see in the Dehancer plugin is that you are starting from a preset with a historical basis in reality, and the controls in the software enable you to precisely and subtly adjust that to develop your own look or style. Since the changes you are making are subtle, the less likely you are to completely destroy what was a perfectly good image to start with.
So is it worth the money?
If you have paying clients that say want a specific film look, then the answer is a resounding yes, it is. If you find using curves in Lightroom or Photoshop too daunting and/or complicated, then the answer is also yes. But if you know your way around Photoshop and Lightroom's advanced features, then you probably don't need this plugin. But, having said that, if you have the budget and are looking for high-quality effects that you can tailor to develop your own unique style, then Dehancer Film Emulation might be worth a try.
If you do want to check this software out, we've put a link into the description. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you want to see more like this. It really helps the channel.